Miss Evans, stand. You are charged by this court with being a petty thief. Tell me, how do you plead?
I didn't do it. I swear I didn't do it.
Are there any witnesses present who can speak for or against this person?
I saw her. She stole my locket.
I didn't do it.
I find you, Miss Evans, guilty of the charge of thievery. Since this is your first offense,
You will be sentenced to 10 lashes at the whipping post next to the stocks in front of the courthouse. If this happens again, young lady, you will lose one finger, and it'll be a finger of my choice. Sit down. Where is Mr. Metter?
Here, sir.
You are charged by this court with gambling on the Sabbath. Tell me, how do you plead?
Not guilty, sir. I swear.
Any witnesses here that have seen him gamble?
I saw him.
Anyone else? I need 3.
I saw him.
One more.
Yes, I saw him also.
Guilty. I find you guilty in the charge of gambling on the Sabbath. Your punishment is to be in the stocks in front of the courthouse for 2 days. Sit down. Miss McElhaney, stand up. You are charged in this court with gossiping
I never.
about your neighbors. Are there any witnesses, including neighbors, here today that can verify these charges? Anyone?
Talking about me.
There's 1,
She's been a gossip as long as I can
2,
remember.
3. Thank you. I find you, Miss McElhaney, guilty of the charge of gossiping. You will be placed in the dunking chair at the ferry landing and dunked repeatedly until you repent of your wickedness. Sit down. Oh my goodness, Mr. Oaten again.
It seems that ever since we've started having court outside of Charlestown, it's the same people every session causing these problems.
Mr. Oaten, stand up if you can. You are charged by this court with public drunkenness. How do you plead if you can?
Guilty.
Don't sit down. I find you, Mr. Oaten, again guilty of the charge of public drunkenness. Your sentence is to stand in front of the courthouse with a sign around your neck telling everyone that you are a drunkard for 2 days and 2 nights. 1 day to sober up, and the second to reflect on your despicable conduct.
Your Honor, can I get a
Nope.
pint of rum for
Everyone
one day?
out, follow me.
Oh, come on.
Out. Out.
If
Open the
we
door.
locked up everyone in Camden, except for the worst offenders for drunkenness, the jail would be full. So, now, my friend Henry will take charge of the court. For the past few years, the circuit court judges have listened understandably to grand jury complaints about what the Commons House of Assembly has not been doing for backcountry communities. This time, Judge Drayton is planning to journey throughout the colony and trying to convince our backcountry neighbors to support the Commons in their arguments with Parliament.
Gentlemen of the grand jury, please be seated. You are now met to discharge one of the most important duties in society, for you are assembled arbiters of the innocence or guilt of such of your fellow citizens who are so unfortunate as to have afforded occasion, however slight, for the laws to take cognizance of their conduct. You are authorized to pass judgment, in the first instance, upon the apparently guilty wretch, and by your acquitting voice to shield apparent innocence from a malicious prosecution. Such powers have the Constitution of your country vested in you, powers no less important than truly honorable when exercised with fearless integrity. It is your indispensable duty to endeavor to exercise these powers with propriety. It is mine concisely to point out to you the line of your conduct, a conduct which the venerable Constitution of your country intends, by protecting the innocent and delivering the guilty over to the course of law. You should operate to nourish, in its native vigor, even that Constitution itself, from whose generous spirit we have a title to call ourselves free men, an appellation which particularly describes and distinguishes the English subjects, those unfortunately disappointed fellow citizens in Quebec excepted, and ranks them above all the civilized nations of the earth. By as much as you prefer freedom to slavery, by so much ought you to prefer a generous death to servitude, and to hazard everything to endeavor to maintain that rank which is so gloriously preeminent above all other nations. You ought to endeavor to preserve it, not only for its inestimable value, but from a reverence to our ancestors from whom we received it, and from a love of our children, to whom we are bound by every consideration to deliver down this legacy, the most valuable that ever was or can be delivered to posterity. It is compounded of the most generous civil liberty that ever existed, and the sacred Christian religion, released from the absurdities which are inculcated, the shackles which are imposed, the tortures which are inflicted, and the flames which are lighted, blown up and fed with blood by the Roman Catholic doctrines, doctrines which tend to establish a most cruel tyranny in church and state, a tyranny under which all Europe groaned for many ages. And such are the distinguishing characters of this legacy, which may God in His infinite goodness and mercy long preserve us and graciously continue to our posterity, but without our pious and unwearied endeavors to preserve these blessings, it is folly and presumption to hope for a continuance of them. Hence, in order to stimulate your exertions in favor of your civil liberties, which protect your religious rights, instead of discoursing to you the laws of other states and comparing them to our own, allow me to tell you what your civil liberties are, and to charge you, which I do in the most solemn manner, to hold them dearer than your lives. A lesson and charge at all times is proper from a judge, but particularly so at this crisis, when America is in one general and generous commotion touching this truly important point. It is unnecessary for me to draw any other characters of those liberties than that great line by which they are distinguished, and happy it is for the subject that those liberties can be marked in so easy and in so distinguishing a manner. And this is the distinguishing character. English people cannot be taxed. Nay, they cannot be bound by any law unless by their consent, expressed by themselves or their representatives of their own election. This colony was settled by English subjects, by a people from England herself, a people who brought over with them, who planted in this colony, and who transmitted to posterity the invaluable rights of Englishmen, rights which no time, no contract, and no climate can diminish. Thus possessed of such rights, it is the most serious importance that you strictly execute those regulations which have arisen from such a parentage, and to which you have given the authority of laws, by having given your constitutional consent that they should operate as laws, For by your not executing those required laws, you could weaken the force and would show, I almost say, a treasonable contempt of those constitutional rights out of which your laws arise, and which you ought to defend and support at the hazard of your lives by all the ties which mankind must hold dear and most sacred, your reverence to your ancestors, your love to your own interest, your tenderness to your posterity, and by the lawful obligations of your oath, I charge you to do your duty to maintain the laws, the rights, the Constitution of your country, even at the hazard of your lives and fortunes. Some courtly judges style themselves the king's servants, a style which sounds harshly in my ears, inasmuch as being a servant implies obedience to the orders of the master. And such judges might possibly think that, in the present situation of American affairs, this charge is inconsistent with my duty to the king. But for my part, in my judicial character, I know no master but the law. I am a servant, not to the king, but to the Constitution. And in my estimation, I shall best discharge my duty as a good subject to the king and a trusty officer under the Constitution when I boldly declare the law to the people and instruct them in their civil rights. Indeed, you gentlemen of the grand jury cannot properly comprehend your duty and your great obligation to perform it unless you know those civil rights from which these duties spring, and by knowing the value of those rights, thence learn your obligations to perform these duties. Having thus generally touched upon the nature and importance of your civil rights, in order to excite you to execute those laws to which they have given birth, I will now point out to you the particular duties which the laws of your country require at your hands. Unbiased by affection to, and unawed by fear of any man or set of men, you are to make presentment of every person and of every proceeding militating against the public good. The law orders me to particularly give in charge to watch carefully over our Negro Act and our jury law, a law which cannot be too highly valued, whether we regard the excellency of its nature or the importance of its object. This law carries in itself an indelible mark of what high importance the legislature thought of it when they enacted it. And it carries itself also a kind of prophecy that its existence in its native vigor would, in after times, be endangered, and therefore it is that the law orders the judges ever to charge the grand juries to watch over it with care. Indeed, you ought to do so with the most jealous circumspection. A learned judge says, every new tribunal erected for the decision of facts without the intervention of a jury is a step towards aristocracy, the most oppressive of absolute governments. And it is therefore a duty which every man owes to his country, his friends, his posterity, and himself to maintain to the utmost of his power this valuable Constitution in all of its rights, to restore it to its ancient dignity, and if at all impaired, to amend it whenever it is defective. And above all, to guard with the most jealous circumspection against the introduction of new and arbitrary methods of trial, which under a variety of plausible pretenses may in time imperceptibly undermine the very best preservative of English liberty. Mr. Justice Blackstone terms the English trial by jury the glory of English law. Let me tell you, our trial by jury is that kind of glory in full meridian luster, in comparison of which the English mode appears only with diminished splendor. But let not your care of this great object occupy all of your attention. You are to find all such bills of indictment as the examination of witnesses in support of them may introduce you to think there is a probability that the fact charged is true. For you are not to exact such circumstantial and positive evidence as would be necessary to support the indictment before a petit jury. To make those presentments and to find these bills, it is not necessarily that you all agree in opinion. 12 united voices among you are sufficient to discharge the duties of a grand jury. but it is absolutely necessary that the 12 of you agree in opinion upon every point under your consideration. And happy, thrice happy are that people who cannot be made to suffer under any construction of the law, but by the united voices of 24 impartial men, having no interest in the cause, but that the laws be executed and justice be administered. In short, that you may discharge your duty with propriety, and that you may pursue that course of conduct which the law requires. Let me, in the strongest terms, recommend to you that you keep constantly in your mind the nature and particulars of the oath which you have just taken. To this oath is as of much importance as the mariner's compass is to those who sail on the ocean. This points out the course of their voyage. Your oaths as clearly points out to you the course of your conduct. I dare say you are willing to discharge that duty to which you owe society. I make no doubt but that you will discharge it with advantage to the public and therefore with honor to yourselves. Gentlemen, Mr. Singleton.
We thank you, Judge Drayton, for this charge to the grand jury. Well, gentlemen, what say you?
I say, we are Englishmen. Hear, hear. And we do not want to alienate our king. Hear, hear. Parliament has always taxed us. And yes, Parliament has passed unjust laws. But think about the strong economic ties. Hear, hear. Think about the protection the British Army gave us in the late war. Hear, hear. Think about the protection the British Navy provides our merchant ships. Hear, hear. Save the king. What are the consequences of this action? What punishments will we incur for going against the king's authority? Is it worth it? Or are we crossing a line from which we cannot step back?
Our loyalty is to the king.
Hear, hear, hear.
But our problem is Parliament and their unjust taxes.
Hear, hear.
We've already dealt with lawlessness in the backcountry. We forced the colonial government to listen to our demands and give us law and order.
Hear, hear, hear.
We demanded representation in the colonial government. And we must demand representation in Parliament.
Hear, hear.
We must do something now
Hear, hear.
to make our voices heard, both in the Low Country and in Great Britain. Remember, hard times call for harsh measures.
I agree with your sentiments, sir. You are correct. Harsh times call for harsh measures.
Thank you, gentlemen. I, Matthew Singleton, Foreman of the Camden District Grand Jury, have a unanimous decision signed by myself and the 21 signatories who have made presentments that read as follows. And here are the presentments from the grand jury. We present as a grievance the extensive bounds of the parish of St. Mark, which gives and makes it difficult for the church wardens and overseers of the poor to collect the poor tax, and a greater means to hinder the propagation of the gospel in the back parts of said parish. We present as a grievance and present that there is not a law to ascertain the price of entertainment at public houses, of which there are a great number in the Camden District. and they frequently impose on strangers and travelers alike by making them pay exorbitantly for what they stand in need of, to the great detriment of the poor. We present as a grievance of the most dangerous and alarming nature the power exercised by the Parliament to tax and make laws to bind American colonies in all cases whatever. We conceive such a power as destructive of our birthright as freemen and descendants of English ancestors. Seeing such freemen cannot be constitutionally taxed or bound by any law without their consent, expressed by themselves or implied by their representatives in their own elections, a consent which the good people of this colony have never signified, to be taxed or bound by the laws of the British Parliament, in which they have never had any constitutional representation. And whereas we'd rather choose to die as freemen than to live bound as slaves by the law, in the formation of which we have had no participation, so now that the body of this district are legally assembled as one step toward the defense of our constitutional rights, which are dearer to us than our lives and our fortunes. We think it our indispensable duty to the people of the district, to ourselves, to our posterity, thus clearly expressing the sense of this large and populous district, touching our constitutional rights and the very imminent danger to which they are exposed from being usurped by the power of the British Parliament, taxing and by law binding Americans in all cases whatsoever, being resolved to maintain our constitutional rights at the hazard of our lives and our fortunes. We do most earnestly recommend that this presentment in particular be laid before our constitutional representatives in the General Assembly, who, we doubt not, will do all in their power to support us in our just rights. And lastly, in testimony of the satisfaction we feel and the high estimation we hold for the charge given to us by His Honor the Judge at the opening of the court, and the principles of loyalty and liberty in which the same is manifestly found, and also that a lasting evidence may remain of that true constitutional language which is the duty of every judge to adopt in the exercise of an office instituted solely for the preservation of laws, we make it our request that His Honor be pleased to direct that said charge be printed and made public. We are fully persuaded that every man will read it with applause who wishes a lasting security to the British constitutional establishment of civil and religious liberty. We also recommend that the publication of these, our presentments, be printed. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Singleton. Gentlemen of the jury, I thank you. You are dismissed.
In the end, the grand jury submitted a document that resolved to maintain our constitutional rights at the hazard of our lives and fortunes. The Camden Resolves were published in the South Carolina Gazette, dated December 12, 1774, along with the listing of the signers. They were also presented to the colonial legislature and later were printed in a London magazine in 1775. Later in the month of November, the general meeting called for the election of a provincial congress, with the balloting to be held December the 19th, 1774, in each parish and in the backcountry. Great care was taken to elect good Whigs, and the first provincial congress of South Carolina met on January the 11th, 1775 in Charlestown. They immediately began to form what would later become the independent government of South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the presentation. We invite you back here for some refreshments and later to the tavern at Historic Camden for some more substantial refreshments.